Welcome back to microbiology. Today we're going to be covering the second half of chapter 4. Last time, for the first half of chapter 4, we went through all of the organelles and parts of a eukaryotic cell. And now for the second installment, we're going to go through some specific microorganisms that are eukaryotic, including fungi, protozoa, and helminths. So first, starting with fungi. Fungi can be unicellular, colonial, or multicellular. Unicellular examples would be things like bread or beer yeast. So if I had my Saccharomyces cerevisiae that I can buy in a bag at Costco to make bread, shown here on the bottom with this fluorescent image, that would be unicellular. Colonial would be molds, where they kind of work together, but they can survive on their own. And then there's multicellular fungi. This would be like the mushrooms or puffballs that you might find in your yard. Microscopic fungi exist in two main forms. They can be yeast or hyphae. Yeast have kind of that oval shape you see on the left in the blue and green. And they reproduce asexually by binary fission, where they're just splitting off. And hyphae, on the other hand, are going to be long thread-like cells that form filamentous molds. There are also pseudohyphae. So this is kind of the blurry in between. Pseudohyphae is a chain of yeast cells that when it splits asexually or buds, they still stay attached in a row. So you get this chain of single-celled organisms. They're not true hyphae because they're not a part of a fungal body, but they might kind of try to trick you into thinking that if you looked at them on the microscope. Most fungi exist either as a yeast or a mold, one or the other, though there are a couple that can take either form based on what their growth conditions are. These would be known as dimorphic. So here's some pictures to go with our yeast cells. Looks very similar to what we looked at in the first half of the chapter, the eukaryotic cell having the Golgi apparatus, maybe a vacuole, a nucleus, endoplasmic reticulum. It has all these membrane-bound organelles that you would expect to find. And additionally, you'll see this bud. So this is the parent cell kind of budding off to form a daughter cell. That again is going to have all the same organelles you see in the parent. You'll also see the pseudohyphae that we saw on the last slide, where they are their individual organisms, but they're still kind of vaguely connected here as they bud off. Fungi we will find in the environment and that may not be pathogenic, but we also see quite a few of them that are pathogens that we might care about if we're taking care of a patient. There are around 300 different species of fungi that have some linkage to human health and disease. And we categorize these diseases based on three main attributes. The first is it an environmental pathogen? Is it primarily found in a hospital, or is it an opportunistic pathogen? Environmental pathogens are community-acquired infections in the general population caused from something in the environment. So this would be like if you had a mold in the soil or something like that, and stirred it up and it made you sick, okay? That you normally wouldn't find in everyday life. Hospital-associated infections are ones that are primarily only found in clinical settings. So if we see a fungal infection that is circulating the hospital because we didn't clean catheters properly, something like that, or it got into the HVAC system or something like that. Opportunistic infections are fungal infections that are caused by species that only affect weakened individuals. So these infections typically would not hurt a healthy individual, but they will prey on people that maybe are sick from something else already, whether it's a autoimmune disease, or maybe they already have some sort of respiratory disease that they're being treated for, and then they'll get this fungal infection on top of it. Okay, so some examples here. Environmental infections would be things like ringworm that can affect various parts of the body, has kind of a ring-shaped wound to it. It can be often in the feet, but it can also appear on the scalp or groin. Maybe valley fever you may hear occasionally that presents as flu-like symptoms from a fungus in the soil. Hospital-associated infections or nosocomial infections are pathogens associated with the clinical environment. And these ones have a wide swath of different kinds, basically various fungi that will contaminate healthcare facilities. Finally, we have our opportunistic infections, and these would be ones that would normally not hurt humans, but they will bother you if you are immunocompromised or already sick from something else. Okay, so one such example of a opportunistic pathogen or a mycoses, a fungal infection, is going to be this black mold. Okay, so I have a picture here of it affecting the eye. This is one of the most normal, not scary pictures. If you go Google the black mold, it's pretty sketchy, but this mycoses fungal infection affected a lot of people in India during the COVID pandemic. And it was an opportunistic pathogen. Usually it only affects tens to maybe hundreds of people per year. But with the rise of COVID, we saw a huge spike in this black fungus as well. Typically what doctors would see is a patient would come in complaining of COVID-like symptoms. They'd get tested, they would have COVID, and they might have some other underlying cause, typically diabetes. And because they were sick from COVID, their blood sugar might have been out of whack. It presented the perfect environment for this fungal infection to come in and infect their mucosal membranes, often in the eyes and nose. And this picture does not do it justice, but it is very debilitating. It caused a lot of people to lose portions of their face and even their eyes. And it wasn't COVID that was doing this. It was that secondary infection they got while they already were sick and being treated. There are various ways that fungal pathogens can enter the body, and the ways they come in can also affect the degree of tissue involvement. So it could be that you have like a yeast infection, typically with the urinary tract. It could be ringworm affecting the skin of your feet, or in this black fungus example, it could be in the mucosal membranes of your eyes or nose. Opportunistic pathogens cause secondary issues. So it could be like my example earlier with you already have COVID and then you get this fungal infection on top of it. This is very common also with HIV patients, cancer, and diabetes as well. Fungal cell walls are very tricky because they give off chemical substances that can trigger allergic reactions. So not only do you have an organism that isn't supposed to be there, that's preying on your nutrients and things like that, but the cell wall is also causing an overreaction of the immune system, triggering an allergic reaction. It's important to note as well, in addition to all of these yeast and mold infections, some mushrooms also produce toxins that can have neurological disturbances and even cause death. I mean, obviously there's some that people will use recreationally, not encouraging that, okay? So there's from that side of the spectrum all the way to it could be poisonous and even cause death. Fungi can be both helpful and hurtful. So we see that they're great to have in my garden to increase the nutrients and the yield of my tomato plants, or to help clean up the environment after an oil spill or something like that. but they can also be hurtful in that they could damage the yield of certain crops or cause mold in the soil and root rot and things like that. Fungal nutrition. So all fungi are heterotrophic, meaning that they rely on organic compounds for their carbon needs and their energy needs. So while it may look like they're growing a lot like a plant, they're not photosynthetic. They are growing, but it's because they're using the carbon in the soil, in their environment, for their energy, ATP production, and also as building blocks to help them grow in size. Most fungi are saprobes, getting their energy from dead plants or animals. It's often why you see them in like compost piles or in aquatic habitats where there's a lot of decomposing nutrients available. Some fungi can also be parasitic, so they may require a living host, like a yeast infection would need a living host, but there's others that don't require a living host and can feed on their host before and after death. The fungus will penetrate the substance and secrete enzymes that can help break it down into small pieces that can be absorbed by the cell. So I know this is shocking, I know, but mushrooms don't have mouths. I know, even if you go look at cute little cartoon ones that might, real ones don't. So in this case, the fungus needs to find a way to chop up its food into small pieces so it can be taken in or endocytosed. So it will secrete enzymes that can break down the substances, and then they can bring it in via phagocytosis. Different fungi have different enzymes, and we found a wide range of them. Some can digest feathers, hair, cellulose, even petroleum products. People are looking at that for cleaning up landfills and breaking down plastic products. Some can break down wood and even rubber. Based on the specific species, some can survive in high salt or sugar content rich environments. Others can survive at high temperatures, some even in snow. So they're similar to archaea in that a lot of them can survive in very extreme conditions. The morphology of fungi can be observed typically using a microscope. So when you look at them on the microscope, they'll appear typically as loosely associated cells, somewhat like colonies like you might see with bacteria. The colonies of yeast will look more like bacterial colonies than a lot of the more filamentous fungi would, though they will be bigger when we think back to the size of eukaryotic cells versus prokaryotic cells. That can be a defining feature that could help you determine if you're looking at a prokaryote or a bacteria or a eukaryotic fungi. Filamentous fungi will have more cottony, puffy, hairy, sort of textured surfaces. They will have mycelium, the kind of woven, intertwining masses of hyphae. So you'll have individual hyphae all kind of together into this woven ball known as a mycelium. Most fungi will have hyphae that are septate, meaning that they're divided individual cells. So you'll see each of them here, if their septa are individual kind of rod-shaped fungal cells. Sometimes, though, you will see fungi that are non-septate, meaning that they're all kind of put together here, and they may have multiple nuclei in this same cytoplasm here. Some septa form solid partitions so that there's no communication between the compartments. So this is one cell and I'm not talking to my neighbor, and this is another cell still not talking to its neighbor. Some of them, though, have partial walls with lots of pores in between where they can share organelles, nutrients, energy, cell chemical compounds to talk to each other and work together more as a cohesive unit. Hyphae are classified based on their function. So the two main functions they have are to be vegetative or reproductive. Vegetative hyphae are known as mycelia, and these are responsible for the main growth of the fungi. They'll appear on the surface of it and help penetrate and digest and absorb nutrients. This is kind of the everyday function of the fungi. Vegetated hyphae can give rise to reproductive hyphae that can branch off from them. Reproductive hyphae are responsible for producing spores that can be used to propagate the fungi and help it be released into the environment to find new areas to colonize. Many fungi propagate simply by the outward growth of existing hyphae. So they'll just grow longer hyphae, kind of longer root-like structures, and by just growing out and fragmenting off, they will propagate further into the environment. They can also form spores, though, which is the primary mode for most fungi. Fungal spores are a mode of reproduction. And this is important to note because when we talked about bacteria and the bacteria making endospores, it was very clear that that was not a mode of reproduction. We were just using endospores to survive harsh conditions. That's not true with the fungi, though. So fungi use spores as a mode of reproduction, kind of like seeds in a plant, as opposed to the bacteria with the endospores, where they're just trying to hunker down and make one really strong cell for later. There are two modes of spore formation. There's asexual and sexual. So asexual would be a mitotic division, whereas sexual spore formation is done through fusing of multiple meiotic cells. The two main types of asexual spores are the sporangiospores and conodospores. Sporangiospores are formed by multiple successive cleavages in a sac-like head known as a sporangium. So it kind of ends up looking like a little dandelion puffball, little pom-pom, and that can be attached to a stalk that is the sporangiophore. Conodospores are going to be free spores, so they're not going to be enclosed in a sac like the previous one. These are just developed by pinching off the tips of reproductive hyphae or segmenting vegetative hyphae. So we're just kind of pinching off the ends of the hyphae that are already there. Okay, so to give a visual representation of this, we have the sporangiospores here, where we're making a sac of bunches of spores, and we have a stalk. Again, this is the one, at least to me, makes me think of a little like dandelion puffball out here, okay? But it's all enclosed in a sac. Whereas conodospores have multiple different varieties here where we're pinching off spores off the end here, and they're free, okay? No matter their structure, if it's more branched or if we have more flower-like shape, they're all freer as opposed to the sporangiospores in a sac. Okay, so those were the asexual reproductive types of fungi. Now we're going to look at the sexual spore formation. Sexual reproduction allows for more genetic diversity. So if we're thinking, okay, why would you want asexual versus sexual reproduction? Asexual reproduction is nice because it's quick. You just need yourself and you just make a copy, photocopy yourself and move on. Okay, so it's really easy to get lots of copies really quickly, but they're all going to be clones of each other. As opposed to sexual reproduction, you get more genetic diversity because you're going to be kind of shuffling the gene pool and getting half the chromosomes from mom, half the chromosomes from dad. I guess there's not mom and dad fungi here, okay, but half from one individual and half from the other, shuffle them together and you get more genetic diversity. This diversity allows for potentially advantageous adaptations. So again, if we're going for survival of the fittest, if we can make more permutations and more different varieties, there is a better chance that that fungal species will survive. Most fungi will produce sexual spores at some point, though a lot of them kind of have the option of doing asexual or sexual reproduction. So they have a couple of different ways that they can go about sexual reproduction. The first is to have fertile hyphae of two different strains. So we just get a strain that's self and a strain that's not self, and we can take a meiotic cell from each of those and combine them. Cool. We can also get union of female or male structures. Okay, so some fungi will delineate which structure is female, which one is male, and make sure that we get one of each, while others have special fruiting structures, think like mushrooms, that are going to be helping propagate and perform sexual spore formation.